Welcome to the Conference of Paris.
Great to be with you, John.
Thank you very much. I want to start, General, in an area that has gotten a lot of attention lately, as you, of course, are fully aware, and you followed closely the meeting in Washington last week, the virtual meeting of President Biden and President Xi. I know that you have considered that one of the most consequential relationships of our time. I'm wanting to get your sense coming out of that meeting. How did the meeting go in your view? Was it a success?
Well, first, John, it's great to see you. It's great to be with you today. It's great to be part of the Conference of Paris. It's a great organization and a very important event each year. I think with respect to the meeting, the success of the meeting can be measured in that there was a meeting. What we found was that there were many aspirations expressed in the meeting, areas where we might work together, areas where we should be careful about the relationship. But to me, one of the most important dimensions of the meeting itself, which went 3.5 hours, so it wasn't an insignificant drive-by, was the fact that, A, the meeting occurred at a time when the U.S.-China relationship has become, frankly, quite fraught, and that it was leader-led. And I think that's really important. And you said something important a moment ago at the beginning of your question. We at Brookings, I personally believe that, in fact, the U.S.-China relationship is the most consequential relationship today. And in fact, in the 21st century, it may well be the most consequential relationship going forward. And so the fact that we have seen some real challenges in this relationship over the last several years, and not just recently, and not just with the Trump administration, which is where it was really tested, but over the last several years, this was, in my mind, a positive moment for the two leaders to come together, to agree on the importance of the relationship, and to agree that moving forward, the two leaders really needed to have their hands on this as we go ahead. So in many respects, there was no joint statement. There was no final summary of the meeting, but there was a meeting, and I think we should all be pleased that that occurred.
General, let's talk for a second about one of the real sticking points of that relationship is the whole question about Taiwan and strategic ambiguity, which described a relationship there for so long. Do you still think that's a relevant way to look at how we should assess that relationship going forward?
Well, I think so. We have, for many years, with the Taiwan Relations Act, for now many years, actually. And it was interesting that President Biden actually, in the conversation with President Xi, mentioned that as a senator, he'd actually voted for the Taiwan Relations Act, which gives you a sense of the depth of President Biden's experience with the China relationship. We have been very clear, the United States, that we do not support Taiwan independence. That's inherent to our public policy in this regard. But we're also very clear that we oppose any forceful change in the status quo across the strait. And so from our perspective, any outcome with respect to the long-term relationship between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China ought to be determined on the basis of their conversation. And that's really important to us going forward.
Well, General, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about one of the real sticking points of the relationship, and that has to do with Taiwan and the whole question of strategic ambiguity. I know that has been our policy there and our position for a long time. But do you think that is relevant for the time that we're in to continue on that strategic ambiguity posture?
Well, I absolutely think so. We have, as the United States, been very clear in our public policy with respect to the one China policy, as it's known, which emerges from the Taiwan Relations Act, that we do not support Taiwan independence. We've been clear about that. But we also say that we will oppose any forceful change to the status quo across the strait. From our perspective, clearly adhering to a one China policy, it's also very clear for us that any change in the status quo between China and Taiwan ought to come from a negotiated outcome. Not one imposed by force on one side or the other. I think we know that it would be an outcome imposed by the Chinese on the Taiwan people. So I think we've been pretty clear on it. I think strategic ambiguity still has its purpose as we move forward in our relationship with China.
One other thing on Taiwan in general, there was a comment recently by former Secretary of State Kissinger, looking at the possibility of a hot conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. He says he doesn't see it, at least certainly not in the near term. Looking down for the next decade or so, he says he doesn't see a conflict happening, despite a lot of chatter. As you know, being in Washington, there's been a lot of chatter about that in Washington of late. What's your view? What's your thinking on that?
Well, I used to actually own the Taiwan portfolio during the last Bush administration. And I worked very closely with the Chinese across the strait at the same time. And we've heard, if you will, spikes of rhetoric from time to time. And so this is not new for us. The fact that we're hearing the Chinese are very assertive and very declarative in their intent to prevent Taiwan independence. So we've heard all this before. I'm not concerned about it. And I would probably agree with Secretary Kissinger on this, that so long as everyone has a cool head and we don't see any renegade element declaring the independence of Taiwan, I think we're fine. Now, there has to be at some time, and we hear it now from time to time, rhetoric in China that would seem to be seeking to appeal to a nationalist opinion. And with that the case, we have to be very careful not to stoke that ourselves. If the Chinese have to have an internal conversation about this, then that's fine. But we're very clear that we oppose any intentional change by force of the status quo across the strait. We're clear on that, and I think that's all we need to say about it. And I think the strategic ambiguity is valuable in that regard. And to Secretary Kissinger's view, so long as all the heads are cool across the process, I think we'll be fine.
One question on China and Europe, because so many of the people listening and watching us right now are in Europe. And certainly, of course, this is the Conference of Paris. How about the relationship between China and Europe? Has China overplayed its hand? Because the relationship there has gotten much more strained in the last few months.
Well, I think it has. And we've seen President Xi attempt to rein back in some of the untoward rhetoric of some of his diplomats and some of his ambassadors, which has been, in some cases, quite provocative and quite confrontational. But the United States, I think, is clear with our friends in Europe that bilateral relations with China is a matter of national sovereignty and national decision-making in capitals. And what we've seen is that increasingly, both Europe as an entity, the EU, and individual states in their bilateral relationships with China have been far more circumspect in how they see their relationship with China and their way ahead. And we're very careful in the United States, at least we have been in the past, and I suspect we will in the future, not to try to create the appearance of the United States wanting to have our allies make choices. In other words, don't expect an ally to have to choose between the United States and China. There is plenty of opportunity for our allies in Europe, but our allies anywhere in the world, to have a relationship with China. What we ask is that they're very clear about what that relationship might mean for their own internal decision-making, their economic health going forward, and the potential for them to preserve their democratic sovereignty in so many ways. And as we know very clearly, a relationship with China can be difficult for all of those issues.
General, to move on from China for a minute, what do you see as the main changes in the 21st century that would demand a new focus and approach to American leadership?
Well, I think that first, that's a great question. And I think that one of the challenges that we're going to have in the 21st century is more reliance or continued reliance on multilateralism. You know, most of us believe in the UN and we believe in multilateral organizations, standing organizations. But many of those organizations have become quite long in the tooth, so to speak. They have been around for a long time. And some of them have not really adapted or adjusted to some of the realities of the 21st century. And so while we will continue to support the UN and its family of entities and other international organizations, I fully believe the United States, as we've heard this administration, which has been very clear on the subject, will continue to embrace multilateralism. And so I think going forward, the challenges that we will face in the 21st century on issues associated with climate and pandemics, the pandemic, COVID, has really exposed inequality in the world in so many ways. We'll need to see multilateral solutions to many of these problems going forward. And so leadership in the 21st century is going to require a willingness to work first in the context of diplomacy, but also in the context of multilateralism. And I see that that's a very positive declaration on the part of this administration in Washington today. But I think another very important dimension of the 21st century is the evolution of technology. And it isn't just that technology is changing, but the rate of change of technology is just breathtaking. And as we see technology continue to evolve, whether it's artificial intelligence or supercomputing or quantum computing, big data analytics, the whole world associated with biotechnology, and what biotechnology can do with respect to climate, or what biotechnology can do with respect to human enhancement for the good of all humankind, or frankly, what biotechnology can do with respect to aspects of terror and terrorism that we can't even begin to imagine. We're going to have to come to grips as a community of nations, in particular the community of democracies, on how technology will ultimately fit in how we relate to each other, how we can harness technology for the good of our societies, and how in the context of some of these technologies that may be used for ill, either by autocratic or authoritarian regimes, or just illiberal elements or terror and transnational crime, we're going to have to fully understand the potential of these technologies so that we can work together to maximize their benefit, but also limit our liabilities and our vulnerabilities to these technologies, limit the peril that we may face as a result of them.
Certainly, technology is, as you said, deeply important. But I wanted to go back to some that you mentioned in passing and see if we can flesh that out a little bit more, the COVID pandemic. Certainly, it will continue to have long-term effects on the international community. Where, in your view, have these impacts been most significant? And what role do you think does American leadership have to play in helping to resolve issues like health crises like these pandemics?
Sure. Well, I think that the COVID pandemic really exposed a lot of the challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century. In some respects, COVID, I believe, strengthened the hands of authoritarian regimes or illiberal regimes to impose its will on, to take the opportunity to impose its will on civil society and the society more broadly. I believe it created real challenges for democracies that has had to come to grips. And as I speak to you today, probably, we will see that there have been demonstrations in the streets in capitals across Europe dealing with yet another wave of the pandemic as it has washed across the societies, and the really assertive measures that have been taken in some capitals with respect to mandatory vaccinations and vaccine passports, et cetera, it has really caused challenges for the democracies as well. So while it has strengthened some authoritarian entities and states, it has also caused some challenges in democratic governance. But I also think, I'll finish my thought. But I think in a very real and important way, it has exposed inequality in the world. And this is something we should all be deeply concerned about. I'll stop, John. You wanted to come in?
No. I know in talking about inequality in the world, the UN and the World Bank and others have actually really shown how major that has been. That's right. What it will do to poverty rates going forward. Yeah. But I wanted to pick up on that, I guess to some extent, to ask you in terms of how the U.S. has responded to the rest of the world with pandemic. The approach that the Biden administration has taken, and it's been giving millions of doses of vaccines to countries all around the world. Is that the right approach? Is there another way of doing, such as what's being discussed this week at the WTO in terms of allowing countries such as South Africa and India to manufacture their own?
Well, you in many respects just answered your own question, and I was coming to all this. Look, the massive inequality that has been exposed around the world, it demands a concerted action. It demands the action of international organizations. It demands the actions of organizations like the IMF and the World Bank Group and the WTO. In this area, the United States can effect, I think, important leadership. First, by encouraging these collective actions, and then, importantly, supporting them. And I do believe that we should be permitting through these organizations a broader manufacturing and a broader distribution of the resolution or the vaccines, the medicinal resolution to this campaign and this pandemic. We should be doing all we can to foster this. And I'll tell you that in my mind, at the very beginning of the outbreak, the very beginning of the pandemic, because of the administration in the United States, we really missed an opportunity to exert and to display American leadership, to bring together those countries, which, by the way, were all struggling with their own pandemic realities, but to bring them together to begin to forge a concerted multilateral campaign, not just to try to solve our own problems, but at the same time, and absolutely essentially, begin to take steps necessary to deal with the enormity of the inequality that we have seen. So many countries in the world that had marginally capable healthcare systems saw those systems collapse in their entirety. So helping in a concerted multilateral way and leading that process and encouraging the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and the other financial organizations, the regional banks, to take the steps necessary to begin to address those that matter, that reality of inequality is, I think, absolutely an essential role for the United States, completely apart from, but in support of, the U.S. moving to a high level of manufacture of the vaccines that we have produced for the American public and getting those out into the international community as well. So there's a lot of room for American leadership, but we lost a long period of time, lost a lot of opportunity in the last administration, which really refused in many ways to embrace an international solution with an American role in it. You know, at one point, Brookings led a bilateral conversation with Chinese colleagues about where the United States could, in fact, work with China on dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and how the United States and China, obviously with the community of nations, could establish for ourselves the measures that could be put in place to prevent the next pandemic. And the next pandemic is coming. It's just a matter of time. And we ought to be taking every opportunity that we can to work with the Chinese and these international organizations, and in a multilateral way, exerting American leadership to try to facilitate this, to both deal with the pandemic as it exists, to try to assist in that element of the global community that has no or limited capacity to help themselves, and to set the conditions in place to prevent the next pandemic. That's an important role for American leadership. I think this administration is up to it, but we got a lot of ground to cover to get back in a position where we can actually be effectual in that.
That's very sobering, General, in terms of talking about the next pandemic is coming. Certainly, it's reality. And you said the administration is up to it, but do you see them doing it, preparing for that next pandemic?
Well, it's one thing to say, it's another thing to do. This administration has, in fact, been very clear that it wants to prepare for the next pandemic, to reload our strategic reserves. But I think it can't just be about reloading the American strategic reserve. We need to bring, again, together the community of nations to begin the process of thinking about the strategic reserves for a global solution to the next pandemic. So it can't just be, the U.S. role cannot just be about protecting the U.S. We'll, of course, do that because it's a matter of national interest, and France will do that, and other European states will do that. They'll take the steps necessary to defend their populations against the next potential pandemic. But we can't be caught flat-footed again the way we were this time. I mean, millions are dead. Hundreds of millions have been sickened by this. And we can't afford to have this happen again. And we can foresee the kinds of measures that ought to be taken, both in terms of international cooperation to be ready to produce the next vaccine, which actually occurred very quickly relative to the speeds with which vaccines have been produced in the past. But we should be poised now for the next pandemic, which is about medical surveillance, about an intelligence collection capability that doesn't intrude on sovereignty and all those typical issues, but a medical surveillance capabilities that can give us enough early warning of the potential outbreak of the next pandemic, starting out as an epidemic in a region where we could, as a global community, contain that problem and bring to bear the very best medical capacity that we can, again, as a community response, and ultimately contain it and solve it there before it can explode into a pandemic again. These are the kinds of things we should be thinking about. And we're not even a full year into this administration, yet the administration, I think, has been pretty clear that it would like to move in that direction. And we'll see. We'll see if it's able to make it happen.
Well, General, there's just so much we can talk about the pandemic and go on for an hour, but I just want to move on, since unfortunately we don't have a tremendous amount of time left, particularly. I wanted to talk for a minute about Europe and how important is Europe to America? What is NATO's future role, you think? And can it hold together given trends, for example, in Hungary and Turkey? Should we give up on NATO expansion? I know there's a lot there, but take your pick.
I'm not even sure how to unpack that whole thing. And you and I, again, could sit here all day long. Once the cameras stop rolling, then we should keep talking.
Yes.
First, when we say at Brookings that the U.S.-China relationship is the consequential relationship of the 21st century, in nearly the same breath, we always say that the U.S.-European or the Euro-Atlantic relationship is the essential relationship of the 21st century. And it's essential to the United States. I mean, there is no way for the United States to move forward in the 21st century without having a very close relationship with Europe. And frankly, that relationship was fraught in the last administration. When the president of the United States, and I'm not making this political, I'm just stating fact. When the president of the United States refers to the EU as the number one foe of the United States, and that our allies have been playing us for suckers, it's very clear to our European friends and other allies around the world that maybe there's something wrong here. And that's when we often made the distinction between United States leadership and American leadership. And I will tell you that while there could have been segments in the global community that worried about where the U.S. leadership was headed, American leadership, American leaders and institutions in America have always remained committed to a strong U.S. or even more importantly, a North American European relationship. We think it's essential for the future. It's essential because we share common values. It's essential because we share a commitment to democracy. It's essential because our economies are so deeply intertwined. And you mentioned NATO. I think NATO remains the essential alliance in the future, too, for all those reasons that I just mentioned in many respects, because having commanded the largest coalition in post-World War II, the 50 nations in Afghanistan, I think we'll come to Afghanistan if we have the time. to deal with NATO on a regular basis was for me an extremely uplifting experience. And yes, there is no alliance that is that big that you can't point to one aspect of it and say, will this exist? Will this continue? Doesn't this require reformation? Well, yes. And frankly, NATO is right now undertaking a revision of the strategic concept, which should help the alliance become fit for purpose and ultimately fit for the challenges that it will face. And the challenges are enormous. When you think about the security nature and the security environment of the 21st century, it's the challenge of the physical domain. And Russia, for example, or the potential challenges of China, or the potential challenges that may come from terrorism or transnational criminality. It's the challenge of technology and whether NATO can embrace the kinds of modernization efforts necessary for it to be really a capable alliance that can deter aggression against the NATO members. And so there's a lot that's on NATO's plate right now. But when you think about the enormity of what it means when 30 nations can come together, 30 democracies can come together and commit themselves, commit the blood of their children and the treasure of their treasuries to a common purpose, to the defense of the Euro-Atlantic community. That's pretty powerful even to today. And I see that the challenges will continue into the future. Now, you mentioned that, there are a couple of states within NATO that may be trending to illiberal activities or an illiberal posture. There is no exit route out of the NATO charter. So NATO is going to have to deal with the challenges that we see in Hungary and in Turkey. And that, in fact, is a challenge for NATO. But let me just say that in the context of if one votes in a world of consensus politics, if one state is an outlier and won't vote for a NATO position in the event of the potential for conflict, that also doesn't mean that a coalition of states still can't respond. But NATO is going to have to deal with I think, increasing illiberalism that we face in the world writ large. Democracy is under a lot of pressure in the world today. Freedom House has charted 15 straight years of the decline of democracy and the numbers of people that live in societies that are less democratic. And by dint of where we are and the numbers of countries in NATO, some of those societies are actually inside the alliance. But there's no capacity within the NATO charter to expel a country. So we're going to have to figure out how to work on this.
General, we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you 2 final questions, including one on Afghanistan. But since you brought up NATO and some of the issues involved there, even though Ukraine is not a full member of NATO, there have been some movements of Russian troops on the border. I'm wondering, what do you make of what's happening, and what do you think Putin is trying to do?
Well, certainly, I think he's, as he will often do, is attempt to create the relevance of Russia as a power on NATO's frontier. Zapad has always been the exercise where the full capacity of a modernized Russian force is put on display. But I think it's very clear that under at least this administration in the United States, and given unambiguous U.S. support of NATO, that the NATO would react very, very negatively if something were to expand with respect to Zapad from an annual mobilization exercise, which is the right of all countries. It's the sovereign right of countries to do that, to something that turns into an invasion. That would be a very bad idea, frankly, for the Russians and for Vladimir Putin in particular. So we watch it very closely. I can tell you that we have an unblinking eye watching every dimension of what's happening, both in the physical domain and in the intelligence sphere, and of course in the cyber domain. But again, the Russians do this all the time. It's perfectly within their sovereign rights to do it. We would simply say, I would assume, within the NATO alliance, that any action that would seek to violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine, or certainly threaten the territorial integrity of the alliance, would be met with, in the context of NATO and inside NATO borders, would be met with the most strenuous defense.
General, final question for you. What do you think are the long-term geopolitical implications of the U.S. departure from Afghanistan and for parts of the region?
Yeah, I think we have learned over time that Afghanistan, what happens inside Afghanistan doesn't stay inside Afghanistan. The attack on the United States on 11 September 2001 is the perfect example of how a platform like Afghanistan, now in fact dominated once again by the very entity that welcomed in Al-Qaeda before, which plotted in virtually every dimension the attack on the United States and then later attacks on our allies in Europe, that there will be political repercussions eventually, and potentially terror repercussions. Again, the very people who are in the palace in Kabul right now, many of whom were part of that same organization when we fought them in 2001 after the United States was attacked. But in some respects, it's worse because there are elements of the Haqqani network now inside the government in Kabul as well. And the Haqqani network, beyond being, again, one of these really dangerous terror networks and terror organizations, unlike the Taliban, the Haqqani network is tied into a lot of other terror entities in the region. And so I worry several things. First and foremost, I worry for the Afghan people. The Taliban have very limited capacity to govern that country. We are already seeing the free fall of the Afghan economy, which will create enormous abject poverty for the Afghan people. Much of the Afghan population will be living below the poverty line very shortly. That will result in a very difficult winter, probably in starvation, mass starvation potentially. But we'll also see that Afghanistan can be a platform for these terror organizations in the region. We'll see the potential for, I think, real difficulty with Pakistan. The Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which is their version of the Taliban, has one of its key allies in the palace in Kabul. And where often the linkage between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban was distinct and apart by virtue of the Western presence in Afghanistan, if you're Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, you've got a wind at your back now, and it's blowing out of Afghanistan. So I worry about the stability of Pakistan as we go forward. And I also worry that there are elements that can find safe haven in Afghanistan and in the region around it that are anti-Indian organizations as well. And we remember in 2008, the attack on Mumbai, that came from Lashkar-e-Taiba. And there are elements of Lashkar-e-Taiba that are operating in both Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And we came perilously close to seeing India and Pakistan in a eyeball-to-eyeball concern that had potential nuclear implications. So what's happened in Afghanistan is not inherently isolated to Afghanistan. And we, the United States, need to think very seriously with our allies and partners around the world about what policy we should be seeking to pursue with the Taliban regime that doesn't leave to the deserts of that entity the people of Afghanistan in the future, or the stability of the region. And we've got work to do.
Well, General, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us at the Conference of Paris. Certainly, there's a lot there that you've shared with us in the last 20, 25 minutes, and looking forward to hearing from you in person the next time. Thanks again.
It's my honor. Thank you, John. Great interview. Take care.